The morning train from London pulled into Mittleton station with a precision that would have pleased even the most fastidious railway administrator. It was the sort of station that appeared in none of the major guidebooks. A small, orderly platform of red brick and black iron, presided over by a station master of approximately 60 years, whose pocket watch seemed to regulate the movements of the station itself rather than the other way. Around Hercule Poirot descended from the first-class carriage with the care of a man disembarking from a vessel in treacherous waters. His patent leather shoes gleamed despite the October morning's pale drizzle. His perfectly waxed mustaches, those magnificent, symmetrical instruments of facial expression, were at their immaculate best. He surveyed Mittleton with the deliberate intensity of a museum curator, examining a newly acquired painting, noting every detail: the slate roofs of the cottages beyond the station, the church spire rising in the distance with its weathered stone, the neat rows of chrysanthemums in the stationmaster's garden, already drooping slightly in the damp. Mittleton was, in every visible particular, the very image of an English provincial town at perfect rest. There was nothing here to suggest drama, violence, or the elaborate machinations of a criminal mind. And yet Hercule Poirot had not traveled from London because of what was visible. The telegram that had summoned him lay in his pocket, brief, courteous, and addressed to him by name at his London address. It had been sent by one of Scotland Yard's more senior officials, a commissioner who apparently believed that certain matters of peculiar delicacy required the services of the celebrated little Belgian detective. The commissioner had not been specific. The telegram had merely stated, "Mittleton requires discretion and insight. Arrive Saturday if convenient. Signed, Chief Commissioner." Poirot had arrived on Saturday. A motor car awaited him outside the station, a sensible, serviceable Humber, driven by a uniformed constable whose weathered face suggested he had spent most of his life in rural policing. The constable greeted Poirot with the formal courtesy of a man accustomed to dealing with London officials, if not with men of Poirot's particular reputation. "Mr. Hercule Poirot?" the constable inquired, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "But yes," Poirot replied, settling himself into the rear seat with the air of one taking a throne. "I am indeed he. And you are?" "Constable Matthews, sir. I'm to drive you to Mittleton House, where Inspector Graves will be waiting to brief you." "Graves?" Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "I do not believe I am acquainted with this Inspector Graves. He is new to Scotland Yard?" "County Police, sir. But Inspector Graves has been handling the matter locally." The constable engaged the motor, and they moved smoothly away from the station. As they proceeded through Mittleton's main street, Poirot observed everything with the systematic attention of a naturalist cataloging a new species. The high street was respectable without being prosperous: a chemist's shop, a bank, several modest establishments selling provisions and haberdashery. The people on the pavement seemed to move with the deliberate pace of individuals unaccustomed to hurrying. A postman made his rounds with the solemn ritual of a priest performing his office. An elderly woman swept the pavement before what appeared to be a tea room, and she paused in her labors to watch the motor car pass, her expression suggesting a mingling of curiosity and something approaching concern. "Tell me, Constable," Poirot said conversationally, "what is the nature of this matter that has prompted the Chief Commissioner to summon me to your charming town? Surely Mittleton has not been troubled by anything that would warrant such an action?" The constable's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "That would be for Inspector Graves to explain, sir. I'm not at liberty to discuss the details." It was, Poirot reflected, exactly the sort of response he would have expected. The constable was following his orders to the letter, which suggested those orders had been quite explicit. Interesting. They drove now beyond the town proper, climbing a gentle rise where the countryside opened out into rolling fields and scattered woodland. Here, the houses became fewer and larger, estates set back from the road behind hedgerows and iron gates. It was in this landscape of rural prosperity that Mittleton House revealed itself, a Victorian structure of considerable size, built in that period's characteristic red brick, with white stone trim and substantial chimneys. It was neither mansion nor mere country house, but something comfortably between, the home of someone of solid standing and sufficient means. Constable Matthews turned the motor into the drive, and as they approached the house, Poirot observed that there were other vehicles present, another police motor car, and what appeared to be a doctor's vehicle, identifiable by the worn leather medical bag visible on the rear seat. So, he thought, there has been a death, or possibly an injury, something requiring both police and medical attendance. Inspector Graves stood on the front steps as the motor car drew to a halt. He was a man of perhaps 55, with the kind of broad-shouldered build that suggested a younger life, spent in more physically demanding work than detective inspection. His face was weathered, his eyes an intelligent gray, and his manner suggested that while he might not be entirely comfortable with the arrival of a famous London detective, he was at least resigned to it. "Mr. Poirot," Graves said, extending his hand as Poirot descended from the motor car. "Welcome to Mittleton. I confess I was somewhat surprised when the commissioner indicated you were being called in on this matter. No disrespect intended, of course. It's simply that we are not accustomed to such considerable attention from the higher authorities." The commissioner felt that discretion and an outside perspective might be valuable. Poirot replied, shaking the offered hand with his customary courteous formality. "And I have learned long ago not to question the judgment of those who employ me. Instead, I prefer to observe, to listen, and to think. The brain, you understand, Inspector, it is the detective's true instrument. Not the eyes, not the ears, but the gray cells working in their methodical fashion." Graves gestured toward the house. "Perhaps we should step inside. It is rather cool this morning, and there are several matters I should explain." As they entered the hallway of Mittleton House, Poirot noted everything, the quality of the furnishings, which spoke of money without excessive ostentation, the paintings on the walls, which were competent without being remarkable, the overall atmosphere, which seemed to him to carry the faint undercurrent of anxiety that often preceded significant revelations. Inspector Graves led him into a study lined with books. The study, Poirot suspected, of a man who possessed education without being scholarly. There was a desk, a comfortable chair, and several framed photographs on the mantelpiece. One photograph showed a woman of perhaps 35, with dark hair and intelligent eyes. Another showed a man of approximately the same age, with the kind of features one might describe as conventionally handsome. A third photograph, slightly older and more formal, showed an elderly gentleman with a stern expression. "Perhaps," Poirot suggested, settling himself into the chair that Graves indicated, "you might now tell me precisely what has occurred in Mittleton to warrant such attention." Inspector Graves took a moment before responding, choosing his words with the care of a man accustomed to official reports. 3 weeks ago, Mr. Poirot, a young woman named Margaret Ashton was found dead in her bedroom at the Laurels, a cottage on the outskirts of the town. The initial assessment suggested natural causes. She had been ill with influenza, but certain circumstances gave us reason for concern. We conducted a more thorough examination, and it became clear that she had been poisoned. "Arsenic, Mr. Poirot. A substantial dose, I see," Poirot said, his fingers forming a pyramid beneath his chin. "And what of the second victim?" Graves's eyebrows rose slightly. "I have not yet mentioned a second victim, no," Poirot agreed. "But the commissioner would not have summoned me merely for a single poisoning, however mysterious. The fact that he sought discretion, combined with your evident discomfort, suggests a pattern, perhaps even a pattern that has alarmed your local authorities. Am I correct?" "You are," Graves admitted. "A second young woman, Miss Eleanor Blackwood, was found dead in her residence 10 days ago. At first, her death appeared to be from a heart condition. She was a woman of nervous disposition, prone to anxieties, but during a routine medical examination, certain evidence suggested poison. We exhumed the body and confirmed it. Arsenic again, Mr. Poirot, the same method." Poirot rose from his chair and walked to the window, gazing out across the gardens of Mittleton House toward the distant countryside. "And so," he said softly, "Mittleton is terrorized by the possibility of a murderer at large, a murderer who selects young women as victims. And the commissioner, quite wisely, recognizes that panic in a small community can be as destructive as any poison. Tell me, Inspector, are there any other details that have not yet been shared with the public?" "Yes," Graves said quietly. "The initials, Margaret Ashton, M.A. Eleanor Blackwood, E.B. in both cases. There was a small detail at the scene that suggested the initials had been noted, shall we say. In Margaret's case, a piece of paper with the letters M.A. written upon it was found in her handbag. In Eleanor's case, the initials appeared to have been scratched into the wood of her bedside table. Poirot turned from the window, and his dark eyes gleamed with an interest that went beyond mere professional curiosity. "Ah," he said, returning to his chair. "Now we have something approaching a genuine puzzle. The murderer, then, is not merely killing. The murderer is communicating. This is a significant distinction, Inspector. This suggests that we are not dealing with a person of simple motive, not a crime of passion, not a theft gone wrong, not a matter of domestic discord. No, this is something far more deliberate. This is someone who wishes to demonstrate something, someone who has a message to convey. That is our fear," Graves admitted, "that there will be more victims, that there is a pattern we have not yet discerned." "But of course there is a pattern," Poirot said, his tone carrying the certainty of absolute conviction. "There is always a pattern, Inspector. The question is merely whether we are clever enough to perceive it. And so," he continued, leaning back in his chair with an expression of satisfaction, "I have arrived in Mittleton at precisely the correct moment, before the third victim, if there is to be one, before the pattern becomes so obvious that any fool might perceive it, before the murderer has completed whatever design motivates them." He paused, allowing the significance of his words to settle. "And now, Inspector, if you would be so good, I should like to see the crime scenes and interview the witnesses. For you see, there is much work to be done, and the little gray cells must be properly nourished with details. After which, perhaps your local inn might provide a suitable room and a decent cup of tea. For despite the gravity of this matter, one must still attend to such practical considerations." The Laurels proved to be a modest cottage situated on the road, leading toward the neighboring village of Ashford. It was a pleasant enough dwelling, rendered somewhat melancholy by the yellowing flowers that still stood in the gardens, and the general air of disuse that seemed to have settled upon it since Margaret Ashton's death. The windows were shuttered, and the front door bore the seal of official investigation. Inspector Graves unlocked the door with a key he withdrew from his waistcoat pocket, and together with Poirot they entered the cottage. The interior was clean and orderly, decorated in the modest but respectable manner of a woman of limited means, but cultivated sensibilities. There were books in the sitting room, volumes of poetry and novels of quality. The furnishings were sparse but carefully chosen. Everything spoke of a person of education and refinement. Margaret Ashton, Graves explained as they climbed the narrow stairs to the upper floor, was the daughter of a solicitor in Nottingham. She came to Mittleton 6 months ago to live with her elderly aunt, Mrs. Dorothy Ashton, who has since taken the news of her death most severely. Margaret was 28 years old, unmarried, and apparently content in her circumstances. She spent her time reading, taking walks about the town, and participating in the activities of the parish church. By all accounts, she was a quiet, well-liked young woman with no enemies that anyone has been able to identify. They reached the bedroom where Margaret had been found. It was a modest room, decorated in pale pastels, with a narrow bed, a wardrobe, and a small writing desk positioned before the window. The bed linens had been removed for examination, leaving only the bare mattress. On the bedside table stood a glass and a small bottle that Graves indicated with a gesture. The poison was administered in a sleeping draught, Graves explained, a mixture of laudanum and arsenic. The sleeping draught itself was not unusual. Miss Ashton had been suffering from insomnia and had obtained a bottle from the chemist, but someone had adulterated it with a significant quantity of arsenic. We believe she took her usual dose before retiring, never suspecting the danger. Poirot examined the room with meticulous care, his eyes moving from the bed to the window to the desk and back again. He opened the wardrobe and examined the clothing within. Sensible dresses, a few items of better quality, nothing suggesting wealth or vanity. He opened the desk drawers and found writing materials, letters tied with ribbon, and a journal bound in green Morocco leather. "May I?" he inquired, gesturing toward the journal. "Of course," Graves replied. "We have already examined it thoroughly." Poirot opened the journal and read several passages, his expression remaining neutral. The entries were dated and written in a neat, precise hand. They spoke of daily activities, of emotions and observations, of loneliness and gradual adaptation to her new life in Mittleton. There were no entries suggesting romantic entanglement, no references to conflicts with neighbors, no indication of anything approaching a motive for murder. "Tell me," Poirot said, turning to face Graves, regarding the piece of paper with the initials. "Where precisely was it found?" "In her handbag," Graves replied, "placed directly beneath her nightdress and underclothing, as though it had been secreted there deliberately. It was a small piece of notepaper, of the sort commonly available. The initials were written in blue ink in a hand. That did not match any of Miss Ashton's writing samples. And the paper itself, was there anything remarkable about it? Any watermark, any identifying characteristic?" Graves shook his head. "Common notepaper, Mr. Poirot. The sort any stationer in the kingdom might sell." Poirot descended the stairs, and Graves followed. In the sitting room, Poirot turned slowly, as though absorbing the atmosphere of the room, the character of the woman who had inhabited it. He noted the arrangement of the furniture, the books on the shelves, the small ornaments placed with careful attention. He paused before a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. Margaret Ashton, as she must have appeared in life. A young woman with intelligent eyes and a gentle expression. She was, "I suspect," Poirot said slowly, "a woman of considerable sensitivity, a woman of some education and refinement, but without the confidence that might accompany greater worldly experience. She was content with her solitude, or at least resigned to it. There's nothing here to suggest that she was at the center of any drama, any conflict, any situation that might have motivated someone to wish her dead. That was our assessment as well." Graves confirmed, "Which is precisely what troubles us. There appears to be no motive, no personal connection between the victim and any potential murderer." "Ah, but that is where you are in error, Inspector," Poirot said, turning to face Graves with an expression of almost pitying conviction. "There is always a motive, always. The question is merely whether the motive lies in what we might term normal circumstances: revenge, jealousy, theft, passion, or whether it lies in the realm of the exceptional, of the aberrant, of the mind working in patterns that do not conform to ordinary logic." They left the Laurels and proceeded to the residence of Eleanor Blackwood, which proved to be a larger house situated in a more prosperous part of Mittleton. It was a Victorian villa of considerable pretension, painted white with dark green shutters, surrounded by well-maintained gardens. The house had the appearance of being inhabited and maintained, and Graves explained that Eleanor's family still occupied the residence, though her parents had been devastated by the tragedy. They were received in the drawing room by Mrs. Helena Blackwood, Eleanor's mother, a woman of approximately 60, with the bearing of someone accustomed to considerable social standing. She was dressed in mourning attire, and her eyes suggested that she had been weeping at regular intervals since her daughter's death. Beside her sat a gentleman whom Graves identified as Dr. Arthur Blackwood, Eleanor's father. "We are so grateful that Scotland Yard has seen fit to assign this matter to someone of your reputation," Dr. Blackwood said, rising to shake Poirot's hand. The doctor was a man of about 65, with the kind of bearing that suggested a lifetime of professional respect and comfortable circumstances. "Eleanor was our only child, you understand. The loss is quite devastating. I extend to you both my sincere condolences." Poirot replied with genuine courtesy. "It is a tragedy, and one that I am determined to illuminate. But I must ask questions, some of which may cause you pain. This is, I regret to say, necessary." "Of course," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice trembling slightly. "We understand." For the next hour, Poirot conducted a careful interrogation, his manner gentle, but his questions precise and relentless. He learned that Eleanor had been 26 years old, the daughter of a respected physician. She had been educated at boarding school and had later traveled to Europe for 2 years with her parents. She had been accomplished in music and art, fluent in French, and had been considering marriage to a gentleman named Robert Wainwright, the son of a local banker. "And where is this Mr. Wainwright now?" Poirot inquired. "He departed for London the day after Eleanor's death," Dr. Blackwood replied. "He was quite affected by the tragedy. He believed it improper to remain in Mittleton under such circumstances. "How very considerate of him," Poirot remarked. "And yet, might one not have expected him to remain to offer what comfort he could to Miss Eleanor's family?" An uncomfortable silence followed this observation. It was Mrs. Blackwood who eventually spoke, her voice low. There were some questions raised regarding the attachment between Eleanor and Mr. Wainwright. Some felt that it had progressed rather rapidly, and without proper attention to propriety. "How very interesting," Poirot murmured. "And Miss Eleanor herself, she was content with the arrangement?" "I believe she was," Dr. Blackwood said carefully, though Eleanor had always been subject to nervous anxieties. Her attachment to various young men seemed to vacillate, depending on her temperament. Poirot rose and asked to see Eleanor's bedroom. They ascended a broad staircase to the upper floor, where Eleanor's room was revealed to be considerably more luxuriously appointed than Margaret Ashton's had been. The furnishings were expensive, the wallpaper was of an elegant pattern, and numerous ornaments and decorative items suggested considerable attention to aesthetic detail. The bedside table, where Eleanor's body had been found, bore the marks where someone had scratched or carved the initials EB into the polished wood. The damage was not extensive, but it was unmistakable letters carved deliberately into the surface. Poirot examined the scratches with meticulous attention, determining their depth and direction. "This was not done with a knife," he said to Graves. "Too uniform in depth. A small file, perhaps, or a pointed tool of some kind? We have no way of knowing," Graves replied. "We found nothing at the scene that suggested the tool used." Poirot opened the wardrobe and examined Eleanor's clothing with interest. There were numerous dresses, several of excellent quality. There were hats, shoes, and all the various accoutrements of a young woman of some means. The dressing table held an array of cosmetics and beauty preparations. Everything suggested a young woman of considerable vanity and refined sensibilities, and considerably more worldly than Margaret Ashton had been. "Tell me," Poirot said, turning to face Graves, "what is your assessment of the relationship between Miss Eleanor and Mr. Robert Wainwright?" Graves shifted uncomfortably. "I confess I have made some inquiries. It appears that there was some uncertainty regarding the engagement. Miss Eleanor was inclined toward matrimony, but Mr. Wainwright seemed less certain. There were those who suggested that he had been drawn to Miss Eleanor, primarily on account of her father's wealth and social standing." "How very practical of him," Poirot observed with a slight smile. "And yet, if he harbored doubts regarding the engagement, might he not view Miss Eleanor's death as something of a release?" Graves looked troubled. "You suggest that Mr. Wainwright might be our murderer, but he has departed for London, a departure that does not necessarily indicate innocence." Poirot interrupted gently. "Indeed, it might indicate the opposite, but I think we move too rapidly to conclusions. There are other considerations." They descended the stairs and returned to the drawing room, where Dr. and Mrs. Blackwood awaited them with evident anxiety. "I have one further question," Poirot said, his tone conversational and almost casual. "In the days before her death, did Miss Eleanor exhibit any unusual behavior? Any indication of anxiety or concern beyond her normal disposition?" Dr. Blackwood and his wife exchanged glances. Finally, Mrs. Blackwood spoke. "Now that you mention it, Eleanor did seem particularly anxious during the last week. She was more withdrawn than usual, and she seemed to be in a state of considerable agitation. We attributed it to nerves regarding the engagement." "And had she mentioned any particular concern to either of you? Any person or situation that was troubling her?" "No," Mrs. Blackwood said. "We asked, but she was reluctant to discuss it. She said it was merely a matter of personal concern, nothing of significance." Poirot nodded slowly, and Graves conducted them out of the house. As they descended to the motor car, Poirot's expression suggested that his mind was already working through the implications of what he had observed and learned. "One final inquiry," Poirot said as they began the drive back toward the town center. "I should like to speak with the chemist who supplied Miss Margaret Ashton with her sleeping draught, and I should also wish to interview any individuals who had regular contact with either victim servants, tradespeople, anyone who might have had access to the household supplies or medications." "That will take some time to arrange," Graves replied, "but I shall do so immediately. Where shall I send word when the interviews can be scheduled?" "I am staying at the Mittleton Arms," Poirot replied. "It is a hotel of modest quality but respectable character. I have already secured a room. You may send word there at any hour. I do not sleep much, Inspector. There is far too much to think about." As the motor car carried them back toward the town center, Poirot gazed out the window at the passing countryside, his expression thoughtful and distant. In his mind, the facts were already arranging themselves, patterns beginning to emerge from the chaos of observation. 2 young women, both poisoned by arsenic. 2 sets of initials left at the scenes. 2 deaths separated by 10 days. And beneath it all, a question that burned with increasing intensity. Why? The Mittleton Arms proved to be a respectable establishment, the sort of country inn that catered to traveling salesmen and local businessmen of modest means. Poirot's room was small but clean, with a view over the high street that allowed him to observe the rhythms of the town's daily life. It was here that he spent the evening of his arrival, arranging his few possessions with meticulous care, and then settling at the small desk with paper and pen to begin the process of recording his observations in a manner calculated to stimulate the workings of his celebrated intellect. By morning, Inspector Graves had arranged for the chemist to attend upon Poirot at the hotel. The chemist, a Mr. George Patterson, a man of approximately 50 with the careful manner of someone accustomed to handling dangerous substances, brought with him the original bottle from which Miss Margaret Ashton's sleeping draught had been obtained. "I am most careful about such matters," Mr. Patterson insisted, his manner suggesting a man under some suspicion. "Miss Ashton came to me complaining of insomnia, and I prescribed a standard remedy, laudanum mixed with a calming preparation of valerian root and chamomile. The dosage was perfectly safe and entirely appropriate. I do not suggest otherwise," Poirot assured him. "But I wonder, would it have been possible for someone to substitute a portion of this draught with arsenic, without the substitution being obvious to the user?" Patterson considered the question carefully. If the substitution were done carefully, and if the arsenic were properly dissolved, yes, I suppose it would be possible. Arsenic has little flavor or odor when dissolved. One might detect a slight metallic taste, perhaps, but if the laudanum were sufficiently strong in flavor, it might mask such a taste entirely. "And where might one obtain arsenic in Mittleton?" Poirot inquired. "From me," Patterson admitted reluctantly. "I sell it in small quantities for various purposes: pest control, agricultural applications, and certain medicinal preparations. It is kept in a locked cabinet." But he paused, evidently reluctant to continue. "But," Poirot prompted gently, "but it is not extensively secured. Any person who knew where the cabinet was located, and who possessed a modicum of determination, might access it. The lock is not particularly sophisticated." Poirot thanked Mr. Patterson and offered him tea, which the chemist declined, excusing himself from the hotel with evident relief. Once he had departed, Poirot settled back in his chair and allowed his mind to work through the implications of what he had learned. It was clear that arsenic would not have been difficult to obtain. If one had a reason to visit Patterson's shop, and many people would, one might have observed the location of the arsenic cabinet. If one were sufficiently motivated, one might have stolen a small quantity. The administration of the poison would have required access to Margaret Ashton's sleeping draught and an opportunity to substitute a portion of it. This would have been possible if one had knowledge of the medication and opportunity to visit the Laurels. But what about Eleanor Blackwood? How had the poison been administered to her? Graves arrived at the hotel in the early afternoon with the report from the medical examination that had been conducted on Eleanor's body. Poirot read it with meticulous attention, his expression becoming increasingly thoughtful as he absorbed the details. "The poison was administered orally," he noted, looking up from the document, "but there is no evidence of it being in any medication or food source. Eleanor was not a woman given to taking sleeping draughts or patent medicines. How, then, was she poisoned?" "We have been unable to determine that with certainty," Graves admitted. "Her family reports that she ate the same meals as the rest of the household. Her mother partook of most of what Eleanor ate on the day of her death, and she suffered no ill effects. What of tea? Coffee, water? Eleanor was particular about her water. She preferred it drawn from the well rather than from the tap. It was a peculiarity that her mother found rather tiresome. Poirot leaned forward with sudden intensity. "The well, you say? Tell me, Inspector, has anyone examined the well to determine whether arsenic might have been introduced to its water?" Graves's expression shifted to one of chagrin. "We did not think to do so. The theory seemed too improbable the poison would have diluted significantly, and other members of the household drew from the same well. But perhaps," Poirot suggested, "the poisoning occurred on a particular occasion when Miss Eleanor alone drew from the well. Or perhaps the arsenic was introduced to a container used solely by Miss Eleanor for drawing water. You see, Inspector, it is not necessary for the poison to affect others. One must merely ensure that it affects the intended victim." "I shall have the well examined immediately," Graves said, rising from his chair with renewed purpose. "If we can establish that arsenic was introduced there, it would confirm our theory." Regarding the method, Poirot agreed, but it would not necessarily advance us much in determining the identity of the murderer. For you see, Inspector, the how is often less significant than the why, and the why remains obscure. Over the following days, Poirot settled into a pattern of systematic observation and inquiry. He walked through Mittleton at various hours, noting the rhythms of the town, the patterns of commerce and social interaction. He visited the church and observed the quality of the congregation. He patronized the local shops and listened to the gossip that flowed freely between proprietor and customer. He took tea at the establishment run by a Mrs. Mabel Thornton and observed the clientele with the careful attention of a man cataloging variations in human nature. It was at tea that he first encountered Miss Catherine Ashton, Margaret's younger sister, who was staying with her aunt Mrs. Dorothy Ashton in Mittleton in the aftermath of Margaret's death. Catherine was a young woman of perhaps 25, with something of her sister's refined features, but possessed of considerably more animation and apparent confidence. She was dressed fashionably and bore herself with the unconscious assurance of someone accustomed to attention. "You are the detective from London," Catherine said without preamble, seating herself at Poirot's table despite the fact that he had not invited her to do so. "Everyone in Mittleton is speaking of you. Inspector Graves mentioned to Aunt Dorothy that you had arrived to investigate Margaret's death." "I am indeed conducting inquiries into the matter," Poirot confirmed, studying Catherine with evident interest. "And you are?" "Catherine Ashton, Margaret's sister. I arrived in Mittleton 3 days ago when I heard of her death. It has been quite a shock, I assure you. Margaret was not a woman one would imagine dying in any tragic circumstances. She was so careful about everything." "You knew your sister well?" Poirot inquired. Catherine hesitated. "I knew her as well as one knows one's siblings, I suppose. But Margaret and I were not particularly close. She was 6 years my senior, and we lived largely separate lives. After she came to Mittleton, we corresponded occasionally, but we saw little of each other." "And what brings you to Mittleton now? Surely there are funeral arrangements to be managed." "The funeral was conducted 2 weeks ago," Catherine explained, "but Aunt Dorothy has been quite distraught, and I felt it was my duty to remain and provide whatever comfort I could. Though I must confess, being in Mittleton is becoming increasingly dreary. The town seems to be seized by a kind of paranoia. Everyone is suspicious of everyone else. It's quite exhausting." "Tell me," Poirot said, lowering his teacup with deliberate slowness, "when did you first hear of your sister's death, and through what means?" "A telegram from Aunt Dorothy," Catherine replied. "It arrived at my home in London with the most shocking news. I made arrangements to travel to Mittleton the following day. And during your time here, have you observed anything unusual? Any persons or circumstances that seemed noteworthy?" Catherine laughed, though the sound was not particularly warm. "Everything seems unusual in Mittleton, Mr. Poirot. This is a town obsessed with a single topic, the apparent existence of a murderer in its midst. I have never seen people so focused on a single matter. It's as though they have become collectively hypnotized." After Catherine departed, Poirot sat alone with his thoughts, allowing his mind to work through the various pieces of information he had accumulated. A pattern was beginning to emerge, though it was not yet entirely clear. 2 young women, both educated, both of some standing in their respective communities, both poisoned by arsenic, both marked with their initials. But why? What connection existed between them? And what connection, if any, existed between them and the person or persons responsible for their deaths? It was during this period that Poirot also made the acquaintance of Mr. Robert Wainwright, who, contrary to Dr. Blackwood's assertion, had not entirely departed from the district. Instead, he had taken rooms at a private residence on the outskirts of Mittleton, supposedly engaged in some business matter, but apparently quite interested in observing the progress of the investigation. Graves facilitated a meeting at the hotel, and Wainwright presented himself as a gentleman of approximately 30 years of age, possessed of considerable charm and cultivated manners. I left Mittleton immediately following Miss Eleanor's death, because I believed my presence might complicate matters, Wainwright explained. Her parents were sufficiently distraught without having my presence to serve as a constant reminder of the attachment between Eleanor and myself. I thought it best to allow them time to grieve, but I confess that I have been unable to distance myself entirely from the matter. I have returned to the district because I wish to see justice done for Eleanor. How very noble of you, Poirot observed, his expression conveying neither belief nor disbelief. And yet, you must realize that to some, your departure might appear to be indicative of a desire to distance yourself from suspicion. Wainwright's composure flickered slightly. I do not know what you mean, sir. Suspicion of what? Of having possibly been involved in the death of your betrothed. Poirot replied with perfect courtesy. Tell me, Mr. Wainwright, when was it that you first developed doubts regarding the engagement to Miss Eleanor? Wainwright rose abruptly. I think this interview is at an end. Mr. Poirot, if you wish to question me further, I suggest you do so through the proper channels. With my solicitor present, he departed, leaving Poirot with a satisfied expression, as though something important had been confirmed. As the days progressed, Mittleton became increasingly gripped by a kind of mass anxiety. Though the details of the murders were not widely known, the police had been careful to maintain discretion regarding the evidence. The fact of two deaths, both apparently unnatural, had inevitably become known. Gossip flourished in the shops and on the streets. Theories multiplied. Suspicions were voiced and then retracted. The atmosphere in the town had transformed from that of peaceful ordinariness into something altogether more volatile and charged with tension. Inspector Graves found himself dealing with numerous reports of suspicious behavior. A stranger had been seen near the Laurels on the day of Margaret Ashton's death. Or was it the day before? A tradesman had been observed acting in a peculiar manner, though what exactly had been peculiar about his manner was never quite clearly articulated. A farmhand claimed to have witnessed someone near Eleanor Blackwood's residence, though this was at a distance of several hundred yards, and the identification was uncertain at best. Through it all, Poirot observed and listened and thought. He walked the streets of Mittleton with the air of a man taking the constitutional exercise that his physicians had recommended, but every step was purposeful, every observation catalogued. He visited the homes of various citizens, making inquiries under the pretext of investigating the circumstances surrounding the two deaths, but in reality conducting a far more subtle examination of the psychological currents that ran through the town. It was during one such visit to the residence of Mr. Edward Thornton, a local banker and man of some considerable prominence, that Poirot encountered a peculiarity that had not previously been apparent. Thornton was a man of approximately 60 years, with the kind of bearing that came from a lifetime of financial authority and social standing. His home was impressive, decorated with the trappings of wealth and good taste. When Poirot inquired into any connections he might have had with either Margaret Ashton or Eleanor Blackwood, Thornton's response was initially dismissive. I knew Miss Eleanor, of course, in the manner that one knows the daughters of professional colleagues, Thornton explained, and I knew of Miss Margaret Ashton, though I cannot claim to have been acquainted with her. Why do you ask? I am attempting to establish whether there were any connections between the two victims. Poirot replied, any shared acquaintances, any common experiences or activities. I have been told that you are a man of considerable influence in Mittleton. I thought you might possess information that others might not. Thornton shifted uncomfortably. I fail to see the relevance, but I assure you that beyond what I have stated, I knew nothing of either woman. Yet, when Poirot pressed him further, asking about the names and identities of various people who frequented Thornton's home and business. He noted that Thornton's responses became evasive and his manner distinctly uneasy. There was something being concealed. Poirot was certain of it. The question was what, and whether it was relevant to the investigation. It was Catherine Ashton who, quite inadvertently, provided the key to understanding what might be troubling Mr. Thornton. She had been taking tea again at Mrs. Thornton's establishment, which happened to be owned by Edward Thornton's sister-in-law, Mabel, and she mentioned in passing that her brother-in-law, a man named Charles Ashton, had recently been involved in some business matter of a delicate nature with Mr. Thornton. Nothing disreputable, I hastened to add, Catherine said, but it involved some considerable financial transaction. My brother-in-law was somewhat reluctant to discuss the details, suggesting that discretion had been requested by Mr. Thornton. But I gather that Margaret may have learned something about the matter and was rather troubled by it. She mentioned something to Aunt Dorothy about being concerned that her brother-in-law's activities might bring some disgrace upon the family name. This revelation proved most illuminating to Poirot, particularly when combined with information that Graves subsequently obtained that Charles Ashton, Margaret's brother-in-law, had indeed been engaged in a rather questionable financial matter involving the manipulation of certain investments in which a number of Mittleton citizens had placed their trust. The scheme had not been entirely fraudulent, but it had involved a moral ambiguity that Thornton, as a man of standing in the community, had preferred to keep concealed. You understand the implications, I trust? Poirot said to Graves when this information was shared with him. Miss Margaret Ashton had discovered something troubling regarding her brother-in-law's activities, something that she feared might reflect badly upon her family name. She was, according to all accounts, a woman of considerable conscientiousness. She would have been troubled by such knowledge. She might even have expressed her concern to others or threatened to expose the matter. You suggest that Mr. Thornton murdered Miss Ashton to prevent her from revealing what she knew? Graves asked, his expression doubtful. I suggest nothing as yet, Poirot replied. I merely note that a possible motive begins to emerge, but we must not move too quickly to conclusions. There are other considerations. One such consideration manifested itself when Poirot requested a more thorough examination of the personal effects found at Eleanor Blackwood's residence. Among Eleanor's correspondence, they discovered a series of letters written in a hand that was decidedly not her own, letters that bore no signature and no indication of their origin. The letters were brief and enigmatic, consisting largely of warnings and suggestions that Eleanor should be careful whom she trusted, that she should be wary of the people around her, that she should consider whether those closest to her were acting in her best interests. These are most interesting, Poirot murmured, reading through them carefully. They suggest that someone was attempting to create discord in Miss Eleanor's mind regarding those about her. They suggest manipulation, psychological pressure. This is not the communication of a simple murderer. This is the work of someone more subtle, more sophisticated in their methods. But to what purpose? Graves asked, studying the letters over Poirot's shoulder. That, Poirot replied, is the question that begins to clarify matters. These letters serve to isolate Miss Eleanor, to create in her mind a state of suspicion and uncertainty, to make her doubt those closest to her. And in such a state of mind, would she not be more vulnerable to suggestion, more inclined to accept assistance or reassurance from any quarter? Would she not, in a word, be more susceptible to manipulation? Over the following days, Poirot directed his inquiries in a new direction. He began asking questions about the nature of Eleanor's emotional state, about her relationships with those around her, about any persons who might have had particular access to her or influence over her thinking. It was during this period that a new figure emerged from the background of Mittleton society, a woman named Miss Susan Hartwell, who had come to Mittleton approximately 8 months prior to begin work as a companion to an elderly woman named Mrs. Clarence, one of the more prominent social figures in the town. Miss Hartwell was a woman of approximately 35 years, possessed of an intelligent countenance and a manner that was at once charming, and yet carried about it an air of careful calculation. She had taken rooms in a modest cottage and had gradually become involved in various social activities in the town. She had attended church services and parish social gatherings. She had established acquaintance with numerous citizens of Mittleton, and Inspector Graves discovered upon making inquiries, she had on several occasions visited the Blackwood residence, where she had become friendly with Eleanor Blackwood. It would be worth inquiring into Miss Hartwell's background more thoroughly, Poirot suggested to Graves, and particularly into the nature of her relationship with both Eleanor Blackwood and, if possible, Margaret Ashton, for it seems to me that a woman who has come to a small town for no apparent professional reason and who has managed in the course of 8 months to establish such a wide network of acquaintances might merit closer scrutiny. Graves set about making inquiries into Miss Hartwell's background with renewed urgency. What emerged was a pattern of movement from town to town, position to position, with no clear explanation for the constant relocations. She had worked as a companion, as a governess, as an assistant to several different employers, never remaining in any position for more than a few months before moving on. Her previous employers, when contacted, were reluctant to provide detailed references, though they did not refuse to confirm that she had worked for them. She appears to be running from something, Graves observed to Poirot, or perhaps running toward something. The pattern suggests either that she cannot be trusted, or that something in her circumstances requires her to maintain constant movement, or perhaps, Poirot suggested with a thoughtful expression, both. But we shall discover the truth soon enough. It was on a Thursday morning, as Poirot was preparing to conduct yet another interview, that a constable arrived at the hotel with news that caused even the imperturbable Belgian detective to pause in his morning ablutions. A third young woman had been found dead. Her name was Miss Alice Hartwell, and it was this fact that caused the investigation to take a dramatic and unexpected turn. Alice Hartwell was, as Inspector Graves explained to a suddenly very alert Poirot, the sister of the mysterious Miss Susan Hartwell, who had become such an object of scrutiny. In recent days, Alice had been employed as a shop assistant in the drapery on the High Street, where she had lived above the premises in a small flat. She had been found dead in her bed by the proprietor of the shop when she failed to appear for work at her customary hour. The initial examination suggested that she had died from a poisoning identical to that which had claimed the lives of Margaret Ashton and Eleanor Blackwood, arsenic, administered orally, with death occurring sometime during the night. And the initials? Poirot asked urgently, though he suspected he already knew the answer. H. Graves replied grimly. Carved into the wooden frame of her mirror, small and subtle, but unmistakable, Poirot was at the scene within the hour. The flat in which Alice Hartwell had died was modest but respectable, furnished simply and with little evidence of personal ostentation or comfort-seeking. There was a small sitting area with a chair and a modest shelf of books. There was a narrow bed where the body had been found. There was a small kitchen area and a single window overlooking the street. The mirror into which the initials had been carved stood on a small dressing table, and Poirot examined the scratches with the utmost care. They were less deeply cut than those found on Eleanor's bedside table, suggesting that they had been made hastily or with less deliberation than in Eleanor's case. The pattern continues, Poirot said to Graves, rising from his examination of the mirror. 3 victims, all young women, all marked with their initials. But now the pattern begins to become more complex, for this victim is the sister of Miss Susan Hartwell, a woman who herself has become the object of our investigation. You believe Susan Hartwell murdered her own sister? Graves asked, his tone suggesting that he found such a notion difficult to credit. I must interview Miss Susan Hartwell immediately. She will, I suspect, be quite eager to speak with us now that her sister has fallen victim to this murderer. Susan Hartwell was located at the residence of Mrs. Clarence, where she was still employed as a companion. When informed of her sister's death, her reaction was one of shock and genuine distress, or at least, Poirot noted, what appeared to be genuine distress. The woman's hands trembled, her eyes filled with tears, and she sank into a chair as though her strength had abandoned her. Alice. She whispered repeatedly, not Alice, not my sister. It cannot be. I offer my condolences, Poirot said gently, settling himself into the chair across from her. But I must ask you several questions, Miss Hartwell. Can you tell me when was the last time you saw your sister alive?" "3 days ago," Susan replied, her voice unsteady. "We took tea together at a cafe on Wednesday afternoon. She seemed well enough, though now that I think of it, she did mention that she had received a note of some kind. She did not elaborate on its contents, but she seemed troubled by it." "And did she describe this note to you in any way? Did she mention its contents or origin?" "No," Susan said, shaking her head. "I asked, but she was reluctant to discuss it. She said it was a personal matter and would not trouble me with the details." Over the course of the interview, Poirot established that Susan Hartwell had no obvious motive for her sister's murder. Indeed, she expressed genuine distress at Alice's death and cooperated fully with his inquiries. Yet Poirot also observed something in Susan's manner, a certain calculation, a care in the precise wording of her responses that suggested a woman of considerable intelligence and self-control. "Tell me," Poirot said as the interview drew toward its close, "what brought you to Mittleton? What circumstances led you to accept the position as companion to Mrs. Clarence?" Susan hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Poirot observed her making a decision. When she spoke, her words came carefully, each one chosen with evident deliberation. "I came to Mittleton seeking refuge, Mr. Poirot. Alice and I had been separated for some years. Our parents are deceased, and we had lost contact with one another. Recently, through various inquiries and with the assistance of a mutual acquaintance, I was able to trace Alice to this town. I came here deliberately to renew our relationship. I was not aware that she was in danger. But of what danger were you aware?" Poirot pressed. "What brought you to seek refuge in Mittleton?" "That is a matter of personal concern," Susan replied firmly. "It is not directly relevant to your investigation of these murders." "Perhaps," Poirot conceded, "or perhaps it is more relevant than you realize. But we shall leave that matter for the moment. I only ask that you remain in Mittleton and available for further questioning. You understand?" "I understand," Susan said quietly. In the days that followed Alice's murder, Mittleton descended into a state approaching panic. 3 young women had been murdered in a manner suggesting premeditation and deliberate design. The murderer remained at large. The police appeared unable to prevent further deaths. Rumors spread like wildfire. There were whispers of a madman loose in the town, of a conspiracy of some kind, of various citizens acting as the instrument of vengeance. Several families began making arrangements to leave Mittleton. The railway station was besieged by travelers seeking tickets for London. The atmosphere had shifted from mere anxiety to something approaching terror. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, pressed for the arrest of Susan Hartwell on the grounds that she had the greatest motive, the protection of her sister, or possibly the revenge for her sister's death. But Poirot resisted such action, insisting that there was insufficient evidence to warrant an arrest, and that such an action might actually serve to obscure the truth rather than illuminate it. "Consider the facts," Poirot argued during a conference at the police station. "Miss Susan Hartwell has been in Mittleton for 8 months. Margaret Ashton died 3 weeks ago. Eleanor Blackwood died 10 days ago. If Miss Hartwell were the murderer, what would be her motive for these first 2 deaths? She had no connection to Margaret Ashton that we have been able to establish. Her connection to Eleanor Blackwood was that of a casual acquaintance, but her connection to her own sister Alice is undeniable. Would it not be strange for her to murder her sister now, after going to such considerable trouble to find her and establish a relationship with her, unless she went to Mittleton with the intention of harming her sister?" Graves suggested. "Perhaps there was some long-standing grudge between them, some matter of revenge or jealousy. Possible," Poirot conceded, "but it does not align with what Miss Hartwell has told us regarding her purposes in coming to Mittleton." "No, Inspector, I believe the 3 murders are connected, but not in the manner that seems most obvious. I believe there is a deeper pattern, a more elaborate design at work, and I believe that if we can discern the pattern, we shall discover the identity of the true murderer." For the next 48 hours, Poirot withdrew almost entirely from active investigation, remaining in his room at the Mittleton Arms with the curtains drawn and a do not disturb notice firmly affixed to his door. When Inspector Graves attempted to check on his progress, he was informed by the hotel proprietor that Monsieur Poirot had requested not to be disturbed. except in the case of emergency. During this period of apparent inactivity, Poirot was engaged in the most intense activity of his mental faculties. He was reviewing every detail of the investigation, every piece of evidence, every observation and statement that had been provided to him. He was allowing his little gray cells to work through the patterns, to arrange and rearrange the facts, to discard the trivial and emphasize the significant. He reread the letters that had been found among Eleanor Blackwood's possessions, paying careful attention to their phrasing, their tone, their intent. He reviewed the descriptions of the death scenes, the manner in which the bodies had been discovered, the positioning of the bodies, the nature of the poisoning. He considered the initials that had been so carefully marked at each scene, not randomly placed, but deliberately positioned, not hastily rendered, but executed with apparent care and deliberation. And gradually, patterns began to emerge. The first pattern was chronological. The murders had occurred at regular intervals the first approximately 21 days before Poirot's arrival, the second 10 days before his arrival, and the third occurring only days after he had begun his investigation. The intervals were not precisely regular, but they suggested a progression, an acceleration perhaps driven by the arrival of the detective himself. The second pattern concerned the victims themselves. All were young women, unmarried or on the brink of matrimony. All were possessed of some education and social standing. All had some connection, however indirect, to financial matters or to individuals involved in financial matters. Margaret Ashton had been concerned about her brother-in-law's questionable business dealings. Eleanor Blackwood had been the daughter of a physician of considerable wealth. Alice Hartwell had worked as a shop assistant, but lived above the drapery, suggesting access to the financial records of the shop. The third pattern concerned the initials M, A, E, B, AH, 3 sets of initials, each marked at the scene of the crime. But what was the significance of these initials? Were they simply a taunt, a way for the murderer to claim responsibility for the crimes? Or was there something more deliberate in the selection of victims, whose initials corresponded to some scheme? It was this last consideration that suddenly illuminated everything in Poirot's mind. Like a flash of lightning illuminating a darkened landscape, he rose from his chair, his expression transformed by sudden certainty, and he began to pace his room with the energy of a man on whom a great truth has just descended. The initials were not random, they were deliberate, and if they were deliberate, then they suggested a pattern, a sequence, a design. M, A, E, B, AH, the letters themselves formed a progression. And if one continued that progression, FI, or possibly CD, or DE, but no, Poirot realized it was more subtle than that. The initials were not simply letters in sequence. They were something more complex. Let him consider MA, EB, AH. What pattern united these 3 sets of initials? What connection existed between them that would cause a murderer to select victims? In this particular order, he opened his notebook and began to write, listing the initials, rearranging them, attempting various combinations and sequences. And then, quite suddenly, he perceived it. The initials formed the beginning letters of words that, when arranged in order, spelled out a message. MA could stand for murder awaits or my attention, or EB could stand for every body or each betrayal, or AH could stand for all have or any hand or. But the more he considered, the more Poirot realized that he was overcomplicating the matter. What if the initials were not meant to spell a message at all? What if they were meant to indicate something far more personal, far more specific? He returned to what he knew about Susan Hartwell, her mysterious arrival in Mittleton, her constant movement from town to town, her apparent search for her lost sister. And what if that story was not entirely truthful? What if Susan Hartwell had come to Mittleton for an entirely different purpose? What if she had come to Mittleton to complete some pattern, some design that began with initials and ended with death? Poirot moved to the window and drew back the curtain, gazing out at Mittleton below him. The town seemed peaceful in the late afternoon light, people going about their business as though nothing remarkable was occurring. But beneath the surface, Poirot knew there was a pattern of manipulation, of careful design, of intelligence working toward a specific purpose. He returned to his desk and wrote a message to Inspector Graves, requesting that he come to the hotel at 8 o'clock that evening. Then he settled down to wait. his mind still working through the implications of what he believed he had perceived. When Inspector Graves arrived at the hotel at the appointed hour, Poirot was ready. He had dressed carefully in his customary immaculate manner, and his expression was one of satisfied certainty. "Inspector," he said, gesturing Graves to a chair, "I have determined the identity of the murderer. Moreover, I have determined the pattern that has guided the selection of victims, and I believe I can reconstruct the motivations that have driven this person to such elaborate and calculated crimes. Then you know who murdered the 3 women?" Graves asked, his tone reflecting a mixture of relief and skepticism. "I know," Poirot confirmed, "but I require your cooperation in order to secure the proof that would be necessary to bring this murderer to justice. For you see, the evidence I have is largely circumstantial and based upon patterns of psychological insight, rather than physical proof. I must arrange for a confrontation in which the murderer is confronted with the consequences of their actions, forced to reveal themselves through their reactions and admissions. And who is this murderer?" Graves pressed. "That will be revealed at the proper moment," Poirot replied. "But first, I must ask you to arrange a gathering at Mittleton House, the residence where I was first briefed. When I arrived in this town, I wish to have present all of the persons who have been tangentially connected to this investigation, not as suspects formally, but as witnesses to what I believe will be a revelation of profound significance." Over the next 2 days, Graves made the necessary arrangements. Word was sent to various citizens of Mittleton, inviting them to assemble at Mittleton House on Saturday evening for a gathering at which important information regarding the 3 murders would be revealed. The invitations created a considerable stir in the town. Some citizens welcomed the prospect of finally learning the truth, while others were alarmed at being brought under such close scrutiny. Among those invited were Dr. Arthur Blackwood and his wife, the elderly Mrs. Dorothy Ashton, Margaret's aunt, Catherine Ashton, Robert Wainwright, Edward Thornton, the proprietor of the drapery, and various others who had featured in the investigation to one degree or another. And most notably, Miss Susan Hartwell was invited, along with information regarding the arrangements being extended to her for her sister's funeral. Saturday evening arrived, and the gathering assembled in the drawing room of Mittleton House, the same room where Poirot had received his initial briefing upon arriving in the town. The room was lit by electric lamps, and the assembled company presented a curious mixture of expressions, ranging from anxiety to curiosity to something approaching hostility. Poirot stood before them, his small figure seeming to expand through the sheer force of his personality and conviction. He began to speak, his voice measured and calm, his accent slightly more pronounced than usual, a sign, to those who knew him well, that he was entirely absorbed in the matter at hand. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "I have asked you to assemble here this evening to witness the unraveling of a mystery that has claimed 3 young lives and brought terror to the peaceful town of Mittleton. I have examined the evidence, I have interviewed the suspects, I have applied the methods of systematic investigation to the facts before me, and I have concluded that the person responsible for these murders is present in this room." At this moment, a murmur of consternation moved through the assembled company. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Dr. Blackwood reached over and grasped his wife's hand. Edward Thornton's expression darkened with what appeared to be anger. "Allow me to explain the pattern," Poirot continued, beginning to pace before the assembled group. 3 young women have been murdered. All were poisoned by arsenic. All had their initials marked at the scenes of their deaths. All lived within or near this town. All had certain characteristics in common. They were intelligent. They were sensitive to the actions and behaviors of those around them. And they all possessed information or had access to information that was inconvenient to someone. In this community, Poirot paused, his dark eyes moving from face to face around the room. "The murderer is a person of considerable intelligence," he continued, "a person capable of sophisticated planning and deliberate execution, a person motivated not by passion or simple criminal impulse, but by something more calculated and more ruthless, a person who has carefully selected victims not at random, but according to a pattern that corresponds to, how shall I say, a personal grievance or mission." He turned toward Susan Hartwell, and the woman's face went suddenly pale. "In particular," Poirot said, The murderer is a person who has deliberately cultivated a specific identity in this town. A person who has established herself in circumstances that would facilitate access to the victims and the means to administer the poison. A person who has, through careful manipulation and psychological maneuvering, positioned herself to be above suspicion. This is preposterous, Susan Hartwell said, her voice trembling slightly. You are suggesting that I am suggesting nothing, Poirot interrupted gently. I am stating facts and drawing logical conclusions from those facts. Consider, if you will, you arrived in Mittleton 8 months ago. Within weeks, you had established connections to numerous citizens of this town. You were present in or near the residences where each of the victims was poisoned. You had access to the means arsenic would not be difficult for a woman of education and resourcefulness to obtain, and you possessed the psychological sophistication necessary to manipulate the situation so cleverly. But why? Catherine Ashton demanded. Why would she commit such crimes? What possible motive could she have for murdering Margaret, or Eleanor Blackwood, or her own sister? Ah, Poirot said, turning to Catherine with an expression of deep understanding. That is where the pattern becomes truly significant. The initials, you see, M-A-E-B-A-H at first, I believe they were simply markers, a way for the murderer to claim responsibility for her crimes. But they represent something far more sinister. They represent the beginning letters of words that together form a message of terrible significance. He paused, allowing the tension to build. Murder, he said quietly, awaits each. Body, all, have, arranged, harm, these words forming a pattern of indictment, of accusation. For you see, our murderer was not killing at random. She was addressing messages to someone, messages written in the bodies of young women, in the arrangements of their deaths. But who would such messages be addressed to? Dr. Blackwood asked, confusion evident in his voice. To a man, Poirot replied, turning to Edward Thornton. To a man who many years ago, in another town, was involved in the death of 2 young women. Deaths that were never properly investigated, never properly prosecuted. Deaths that were ruled as accidents, as natural causes, as the inevitable tragedies that sometimes befall the innocent. But they were not accidents, Mr. Thornton. They were murders, and you were responsible for them. Edward Thornton rose to his feet, his face suffusing with color. This is a vile accusation. I deny categorically. I have been in communication with the police. In 3 other towns, Poirot continued calmly, towns where you have lived or where your business interests have taken you. In each town, there have been investigations into the deaths of young women under circumstances that bore striking similarities to those we have witnessed here in Mittleton. In each case, the deaths were attributed to natural causes or to accidents. But in each case, there were inconsistencies, unusual circumstances, elements that suggested foul play. And in each case, you were present in the town at the time of the death. This is madness, Thornton protested, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. Not madness, Poirot replied, but rather the calculated pursuit of justice by a woman whose family was destroyed by your predations. Miss Susan Hartwell is not, I believe, the sister of the deceased Miss Alice Hartwell. Rather, she is the daughter of a woman named Catherine Sutton, who died under mysterious circumstances in London approximately 15 years ago. A woman who had attracted your attention, who had discovered that you were far more than the respectable businessman that you appeared to be. A woman who threatened to expose you, and who subsequently died in a manner that was ruled as suicide brought about by depression and nervous exhaustion. Susan Hartwell's face had become a mask of anguish and barely contained emotion. Her hands clenched into fists, and tears streamed down her face. But she did not deny Poirot's allegations. Your mother, Poirot continued, addressing Susan directly, came to Mittleton seeking to warn Eleanor Blackwood, a young woman she believed might become your next victim. She used the name Alice Hartwell and claimed to be your sister, hoping thereby to gain your trust and prevent you from completing your terrible designs. But in doing so, she signed her own death warrant, for you recognized her, or deduced her identity, or simply perceived that she was a threat to your mission. She was going to stop me, Susan said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was going to prevent me from finishing what I had started. But she could not understand. She could not understand what he had taken from us, what he had destroyed. Inspector Graves moved toward Susan, his hand reaching for the constable's staff at his belt. But Poirot raised a hand to stay him. "Tell me," Poirot said to Susan, his tone not unkind. "What was it that drove you to such extremes? What was it about the death of your mother that could justify the taking of innocent lives?" Susan looked up, and in her eyes was a desperation and a determination that suggested she had long ago crossed the line between reason and obsession. "My mother was not guilty of anything but knowing him," she said quietly. "She was intelligent. She saw through his pretenses. She understood what he was capable of, and he could not permit that. He could not permit a woman to possess such knowledge and remain alive to speak of it. So he killed her, and he made certain that it appeared to be suicide, brought about by her own weakness and instability. The police accepted it. Her family accepted it. Everyone accepted it because it was easier than to question the truth. And these other young women," Poirot prompted gently, "Margaret Ashton, Eleanor Blackwood, your own sister, what did they know? What threat did they pose to Mr. Thornton?" "Margaret had discovered information regarding Thornton's financial dealings," Susan replied. "She was prepared to go to the authorities. Eleanor had developed an attachment to him. She mistook his attention for romantic interests, but she was beginning to see through him, beginning to understand his true nature. And Alice was going to testify against him. She was going to tell people that she had seen him with my mother in the days before my mother's death. She had preserved letters, documentation, evidence. So you murdered them," Poirot said, "methodically, carefully, deliberately. You orchestrated their deaths in a pattern designed to frame your sister, or to create confusion, or perhaps simply to spell out your message of accusation and revenge in the bodies of your victims." "Yes," Susan said, and there was no remorse in her voice, only a terrible conviction. "Because he would never be held accountable by the law. The law protects men like him. The law accepts the convenient explanations that spare the respectable from scrutiny. So I took justice into my own hands, and I would do it again." The remainder of that evening was consumed by the formal procedures of arrest and investigation. Inspector Graves, once the nature and extent of Susan Hartwell's crimes were established, moved swiftly to take her into custody. Constables were summoned, evidence was secured, and statements were formally recorded. Edward Thornton, faced with the revelation of his past crimes and the evidence that had begun to accumulate against him through Poirot's inquiries, initially attempted to maintain his protestations of innocence. But as it became clear that investigations in other towns were already uncovering evidence of his involvement in the deaths of young women, across the course of many years, his resistance crumbled. Faced with the prospect of trials in multiple jurisdictions and the mounting evidence of his predatory behavior, Thornton eventually confessed to a series of crimes that extended back decades. The details, as they emerged over the following days and weeks, painted a portrait of a man whose veneer of respectability had concealed a nature of exceptional cruelty and calculated malice. Thornton had used his position in society, his financial standing, and his manipulation of the institutions that were meant to prevent such crimes, to prey upon young women who had attracted his attention, or who had threatened to expose his true nature. The first victim, as Susan Hartwell had indicated, was Catherine Sutton, Susan's mother, who had died in London 15 years prior, under circumstances officially ruled as suicide. Investigation subsequently revealed that Catherine had discovered Thornton's involvement in the death of another young woman, and had been preparing to go to the authorities when she herself died, supposedly from an overdose of laudanum, administered by her own hand. Subsequent investigation uncovered evidence of at least 4 other young women who had died under circumstances connected to Thornton across the span of 2 decades. In each case, the deaths had been ruled as natural causes, accidents, or suicides. In each case, Thornton had been present in the town where the death occurred. In each case, he had had some connection to the victim. The crimes in Mittleton represented an intensification of his predatory behavior, perhaps driven by the arrival of Poirot, which had necessitated swift action before the detective's famous deductive abilities could fully perceive the pattern. Or perhaps they represented a kind of final outburst, an ultimate expression of a pathology. that had been festering beneath the surface of his respectable exterior for decades. As for Susan Hartwell, the case against her was comprehensive and irrefutable. Her fingerprints were found on the container used to hold the arsenic that had poisoned Margaret Ashton. Witnesses could place her in the vicinity of Eleanor Blackwood's residence. On the afternoon of Eleanor's death, she had purchased various supplies that were consistent with someone preparing to administer poison. She had established herself in Mittleton precisely for the purpose of gaining access to women who had information or suspicions regarding Thornton's crimes, and she had systematically eliminated them to prevent them from exposing him. The most damning evidence, however, came from a detailed journal that was discovered in Susan's modest cottage, a journal in which she had recorded her plans, her methods, her thoughts, and her justifications for each murder. In this journal, she had documented the identities of her victims, the reasons she believed they posed a threat to preventing justice, and the specific steps she had taken to administer the poison and cover her tracks. She had also, in passages that were read aloud during her formal interrogation, expressed her certainty that she was serving a higher justice, the justice that the official institutions of society had failed to provide. "I do not regret what I have done," she said during one interrogation, her voice steady and her expression composed. "I regret only that I could not do more. I regret only that Edward Thornton still lives and breathes, that he is still capable of causing suffering. He destroyed my mother. He has destroyed the lives of countless other women. And the law, that supposedly just and impartial instrument of society, would never have held him accountable. So I became the instrument of justice that society failed to provide." The case consumed the attention of Scotland Yard for weeks. Chief Commissioner himself came to Mittleton to oversee aspects of the investigation. Representatives from 3 other towns attended to pursue investigations into Thornton's involvement in the deaths that had occurred in their jurisdictions. The facts of the case were sensational enough to occupy the attention of the newspapers for an extended period, and Poirot found himself the subject of considerable attention and praise for his deductive abilities in solving what would otherwise have remained a series of mysterious deaths in a provincial English town. The trials themselves consumed several months. Susan Hartwell was tried first in Mittleton for the 3 murders that had occurred there. The trial was attended by crowds of spectators and journalists, and the evidence was presented methodically by the prosecution, guided by Poirot's careful analysis and testimony. The defense attempted to argue that Susan had been driven to madness by the death of her mother and the knowledge of Thornton's crimes, but the jury was unmoved by such arguments. The evidence was to clear, the premeditation to evident, the deliberation to apparent. Susan Hartwell was convicted on 3 counts of murder and sentenced to death. She received the verdict with no visible emotion, as though she had accepted the inevitable consequences of her actions from the moment she had begun planning her crimes. In her final statement to the court, she expressed no remorse and reiterated her conviction that she had acted in the service of justice that society had failed to provide. Edward Thornton faced multiple trials in multiple jurisdictions. The evidence in each case was substantial and damning. In some instances, the cases had gone unsolved for decades, and families were finally able to obtain closure and a formal acknowledgement of the true nature of their losses. Thornton was eventually convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death in 3 separate jurisdictions. He spent his final years in prison, a broken man whose veneer of respectability and success had been stripped away to reveal the predatory nature that had always existed beneath the surface. In Mittleton, life gradually returned to something approaching normalcy. The terror that had gripped the town dissipated as it became clear that the threat had been neutralized and that the innocent would no longer be at risk. The scandal had left its mark on the community. There were those who felt shame that such evil had existed in their midst, and there were those who felt rage at the violence that had been perpetrated in their town. But gradually, the focus shifted and life resumed its ordinary rhythms. Inspector Graves was promoted for his handling of the investigation, and he and Poirot maintained a cordial correspondence in the years that followed. Graves often reflected, in subsequent cases, on the methods that Poirot had employed: the systematic observation, the careful analysis of patterns, the psychological insight that allowed him to perceive motivations and connections that might otherwise have remained obscure, Poirot remained in Mittleton for several weeks following the arrest of Susan Hartwell, attending to the various loose ends of the investigation and providing testimony in preparation for the trials. During this period, he spent considerable time in observation and reflection, as though the intensity of the investigation had left him with a need for quietude and contemplation. It was during one such moment of reflection, as he sat in the drawing room of his hotel looking out over the peaceful streets of Mittleton, that his thoughts turned to the nature of justice, the human capacity for both evil and for righteous response to evil, and the fragile boundary between civilization and chaos that existed in the hearts of all people. "You see, Inspector," he said to Graves during one of their final conversations before Poirot's departure from Mittleton, "what we have witnessed here is not merely a case of criminal behavior and subsequent detection. No, what we have witnessed is the collision of two forms of injustice: the injustice of Thornton's Prada, Tory violence, and the injustice of Susan Hartwell's vigilante response. One person destroyed through decades of unchecked predation, while another was driven to become a destroyer herself in her quest for justice. And what is the moral lesson then?" Graves asked. "Should we not all be grateful that Susan Hartwell prevented Thornton from claiming more victims?" "Perhaps," Poirot replied thoughtfully. "And yet, in becoming a murderer herself, Susan Hartwell did not restore justice or bring the world any closer to a state of moral equilibrium. Instead, she added new tragedies to the existing tragedy, new victims to the roster of the destroyed. The young women she murdered were not guilty of any crime. They were merely inconvenient witnesses or potential obstacles to her designs. In eliminating them, she became as much a predator as the man she pursued." 3 months after Susan Hartwell's conviction, Hercule Poirot departed from Mittleton, traveling by train back to London. He carried with him, as always, a small case containing his personal effects and a collection of notebooks, in which he had recorded the details of the investigation and his reflections upon the case. The town itself continued its life much as it had before the murders, though those who had lived through the events would never entirely forget them. The photographs of the 3 young women, Margaret Ashton, Eleanor Blackwood, and Alice Hartwell, remained in the memory of Mittleton's residents as emblems of the tragedy that had visited the town. Relatives mourned, friends grieved, and the community gradually came to terms with the violence that had briefly shattered its peaceful existence. Catherine Ashton remained in Mittleton for a year after Margaret's death, keeping her aging aunt company and providing what comfort she could. Eventually, however, she returned to London, resuming a life that had been disrupted by tragedy, but never entirely defined by it. She married subsequently and built a life that carried within it the memory of her sister, but was not entirely consumed by that memory. Dr. and Mrs. Blackwood withdrew somewhat from social life in Mittleton, the death of their daughter Eleanor creating a wound that would never entirely heal. Dr. Blackwood eventually sold his practice and moved with his wife to the South Coast, seeking perhaps a change of scenery that might provide some respite from the reminders of their loss. They lived out their remaining years in quiet obscurity, occasionally glimpsed by those who had known them in better times. Robert Wainwright, Eleanor's former fiancé, returned to London and resumed his life in the financial sector, apparently little affected by Eleanor's death beyond what might be expected of a man who had lost a betrothed. He married subsequently to a woman of considerable wealth and social standing, and his subsequent life was one of quiet prosperity and social acceptance. Inspector Graves remained in Mittleton as the local police authority, and his reputation as a competent and thorough investigator was considerably enhanced by his association with the celebrated Hercule Poirot. In the years that followed, he occasionally received consultations from Scotland Yard on cases of particular complexity or sensitivity, and he became something of a minor local celebrity, known throughout the region as the inspector who had worked with the great Belgian detective. As for Mittleton itself, the town gradually faded from the public consciousness, becoming once again the quiet, orderly place it had been before the murders. The shops along the high street conducted their business, the church bells rang on Sunday mornings. People lived their lives in patterns of routine and custom, but there was something changed in the atmosphere of the place, a subtle awareness that the veneer of peaceful ordinariness could be deceptive, that evil could exist beneath the surface of respectability, that the world was more complex and more dangerous than it sometimes appeared. Years later, when Poirot was asked by a journalist about the Mittleton case, he reflected upon it with the measured tone of a man assessing a complex work of art. "What we observe in the Mittleton case," he said, "is a demonstration of a most profound truth that justice, when denied through the ordinary channels of society, does not simply disappear. It does not simply accept defeat and fade away. Rather, it seeks expression through whatever means are available, and sometimes those means are as violent and as destructive as the crimes they are intended to punish." The journalist pressed him further, asking whether he believed that Susan Hartwell had been justified in her actions. "Justice," Poirot replied, "is not a matter of individual justification. Justice is a matter of societal order, of the rule of law, of the institutions that we have collectively constructed to protect the innocent and hold the guilty accountable. When those institutions fail, and they do fail, more often than we like to admit, the result is not the emergence of some superior form of natural justice. The result is simply more tragedy, more suffering, more death." Susan Hartwell believed herself to be the instrument of justice, but in reality, she was simply another victim of Edward Thornton's predation. He destroyed her mother and drove her to commit murders that she might not otherwise have committed. In a very real sense, his crimes extended far beyond the lives he took directly. They extended into the lives of all those who were affected by his violence. And with that reflection, Poirot allowed the subject to drop, and the Mittleton case passed into history, still talked about occasionally in the town, still occasionally referenced in articles about notable detective cases, but gradually fading into the background noise of time and circumstance. Yet for those who had lived through it, for those who had lost loved ones or lived in fear, the memories remained clear and present. The deaths of 3 young women, the revelation of a predator who had been active for decades, the desperate justice sought by a woman driven to madness by loss, and the failure of the institutions meant to protect the innocent. These events had left marks upon Mittleton that would not entirely fade. They had demonstrated, once and for all, that even the most peaceful and orderly of places could harbor darkness, that evil did not always announce itself conspicuously, and that the human capacity for both cruelty and for righteous response to cruelty existed in a balance that was far more precarious than most people acknowledged. In the end, what remained was not a simple resolution, but rather a complex moral puzzle, one that Hercule Poirot had solved intellectually, but which remained, in a deeper sense, unsolved. For there were no innocent parties in this tragedy, only victims and perpetrators, each driven by circumstances and choices toward a collision that left none of them unchanged. The little Belgian detective, with all of his celebrated powers of deduction, could illuminate the facts and demonstrate the truth of the crimes, but he could not resolve the underlying question that haunted the case: whether justice had been served or merely compounded, whether Susan Hartwell's vigilant response had prevented future tragedies or simply created new ones. And perhaps, in the end, that ambiguity was the most authentic reflection of the case, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed detective narrative cannot fully contain the moral complexity of human suffering and the desperate and often misguided attempts to respond to it. The Mittleton cipher had been solved, the mystery had been unraveled, and the guilty had been punished. But the deeper mystery is the mystery of why people commit crimes, why they seek justice outside the law, why they remain convinced of their righteousness even as they descend into darkness. These mysteries remained unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, standing as testimony to the limitations of even the greatest detective's powers of deduction.